Our opening panel is on the key subject of energy, and I'm delighted to say that the panel is sponsored by Eaton. Eaton are an intelligent power management company working to make a positive impact on the world by giving people the tools to use power more efficiently and helping companies do business more sustainably. On the energy panel this morning, we are asking the question, how can we accelerate the shift to renewable energy to deliver on decarbonisation? Energy is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Up to 31% of annual emissions are from electricity and heat, and today's panel will address that. And to our panel of experts, tackling the problem of decarbonisation in the energy ecosystem. And I'm delighted to introduce an incredible lineup of speakers who are Jane Dennett-Thorpe, Deputy Director of the Net Zero Transition at OFGEM, the G.B.Energy regulator. Juliet Davenport joining us virtually, the founder of GoodEnergy and the UK's first 100% renewable energy supplier, which she started back in 2000, so a real pioneer having Juliet with us. Nick Woolley is EV.Energy's CEO and co-founder, where they use a cloud-based platform to streamline and optimize electric vehicle charging. Richard Cave-Bigley, Director of Distribution, Generation and Storage at SSE Energy Solutions, and manages SSE's energy, battery and solar business in the UK and Ireland. And lastly, Richard Molloy, Manager of the UK energy storage business at Eaton, where he spent 25 years as a fundamental player in the business development of the sustainable energy sector here in the UK. Thank you all for joining us here on the energy panel here today at the Decarbonisation Summit. Firstly, before we get into the meat of the debate, I'd like to just go around the table and ask everyone what you are doing in your businesses, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a little 2-minute introduction as to what you're doing to decarbonise within your business. Richard, would you like to have a first take on that subject, please?
Yeah, thanks, Aid. Well, Eaton are a global power management business. We've signed up to achieve our reductions in our emissions globally in accordance with science-based targets to reach 1.5 degrees C by 2030. We're also part of the business ambition to 1.5 degrees C. We've committed to achieving certified zero waste to landfill across all our manufacturing operations globally by 2030. And we're currently investing $3 billion in development of new sustainable energy technologies. So quite a lot of activities going on within Eaton.
Exciting stuff. Thanks very much indeed. Jane, obviously you're from a regulatory body, but what work are you doing in that sort of ecosystem on the subject of decarbonisation?
Thanks, Aid, and thanks for inviting us here and for other people for joining us. So OFGEM sees our role really as making sure that we can make that transition to net zero at the lowest cost to consumers. So in that context, we set out about 18 months ago some key actions that we were going to undertake, and since then we've put a strategy really at the heart of what we're doing, which has got a number of pillars, and I think that really shows the transition that we see the energy industry needs to undertake and our role in doing that. The first of them is around making sure that we've got the infrastructure in place, the low carbon infrastructure that we need, and using our levers to influence that, whether that's through encouraging and approving robust new networks to come forward that are at a good cost to consumers, or increasing the coordination of the planning. The second one that we really need is to start a transition to a really flexible energy system, one that has at the end of the wires, it's going to have renewables and nuclear, and it's going to move away from kind of what we call dispatchable or power stations that can turn on and off in response to demand. And we're going to have to do this in a way that protects consumers, and that's obviously really key to OFGEM's mission. And underpinning all of that, there's going to be new data and digitalisation, and we also need the governance structures in place. So we've got these kind of key work streams, and our job is really to think about how can we help the energy industry reach that transition. I would also just want to say that here at COP, we've launched a new international regulatory initiative together with the IEA, IRENA and the World Bank, because one of the key things that we need to do is we all need to learn from each other. We're not doing this alone. Many countries in the world are facing the same challenges, and we need to learn from each other to do that.
Thank you. And the good news for us all is that Jane is optimistic and positive about our chances of fixing this problem, so hopefully that's good news for us all. Richard, a few words from you on what you're doing within the business at SSE to decarbonise, please.
Sure, and great to be here. So alongside a lot of the infrastructure that SSE's already built and is building in wind and hydro, in energy solutions, we've been investing quite hard in a range of new technologies and solutions, some existing, some very new. So heat solutions, electric vehicle infrastructure, private network solutions for businesses on site to support some of the things they want to do. And then in my area, solar and batteries. So my role is to lead growth of the projects in that area and solutions in that area in the UK and Ireland. And we've been investing a lot the last several years in building a team and a pipeline of projects in solar and batteries. Some large centralized solutions, if you like, on the grid. Some very local and distributed solar solutions close to the point of use. Really exciting area that's growing quite fast here in the UK. It's going to be a really important component, solar and battery, alongside wind farms and the like. And we just announced this summer one of our first big battery projects down in the south of England in Salisbury that we're going to be bringing forward shortly.
Very good. I'm sure we'll come on to that key battery storage question as we get into the conversation. Nick, you're in the world of EV, a subject close to my heart. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing at EV Charge, please.
So I mean, I think the entire mission of our company is really to accelerate the decarbonisation of transport and get electric vehicles integrated into the energy system and aligned with the availability of renewable energy. So from our company perspective, what we want to do, we ultimately need to be carbon negative. So the main problem with electric vehicles is charging electric vehicles and managing the charging associated with electric vehicles. We've got a lot of renewables on the system now that are rising, and they're intermittent, and we need to match the generation of renewables and put that energy into electric vehicles. So what we do as a company is we provide a software solution that allows any electric vehicle owner to plug in their electric vehicle at night and then align their electric vehicle charging with the availability of renewable energy on the grid. What that does in practical terms is it saves, in the UK energy system, it saves around 10% on carbon emissions. So that's 10% of coal and gas-fired power generation that we're able to ramp down as a result of charging at those points in time. In somewhere like California, where the ramp up of gas is really, really extreme, we can save 30% on your carbon emissions. So we can not only hopefully deliver a simple charging service that enables us to move forward and get involved in the electric vehicle revolution, but then also save carbon emissions at the same time. And what we're trying to do is do that in a way that ultimately means, hopefully, that we're having an overall net positive impact on the environment and the decarbonisation of transport and electricity.
Very good. And lastly, Juliet, I know Good Energy is obviously deeply embedded in the field of sustainability, and decarbonisation is totally baked into pretty much the DNA of the company. But give us a sense of what Good Energy is up to, please.
Well, Aidan, if you don't mind, I might go a bit broader than just Good Energy, because I've stepped down from Good Energy now and I'm doing a few other things, which is really exciting. So if I look at the overall piece in terms of speed of getting zero carbon done, we kind of need to think through research and innovation, infrastructure, regulation, finance, consumer, and skills. And I think to be able to actually progress at speed, you need to address all of these, not necessarily in one go in one organisation, but we need to be thinking across the piece. And so at Good, where Good's really focused at the moment is at the consumer end of technology. So it's obviously taken a majority stake in ZapMap, the electric vehicle mapping service, and really looking, what does that look like from a consumer point of view? And there's some really exciting things coming out of there. The other side is Good has always led in decentralized energy. So in other words, people powering their own homes. And we're going to continue to harness that leadership and really push on in there. But just touching on some of the other areas that I think are really interesting, I sit as a commissioner on the Crown Estate. Obviously, seabed's going to be extremely important going forwards, and how we utilize that to the best extent in terms of new technology. I'm just working with an organisation to do an IPO on rooftop solar. And I think what's interesting, we're now at a point in the technological curve where these technologies are going to come back, and they're not going to need a subsidy. And again, getting close to consumer, bringing in finance is going to be so exciting. And then new technology as well, really excited. Just joined the British Growth Fund as an advisor on their low carbon technologies. And last week, I was in Glasgow last week, week, saw some amazing new tech that's coming through, and there's so many exciting people in this sector now that I'm well, you can hear in my voice, very excited about what's going to happen next, how we're going to pull it all together, but we need to keep the momentum going.
Thanks very much indeed. So to start with a big opening gambit question, I think, Jane, I'll start with you on this one as the person who oversees a lot of this. How do we create a more sustainable and flexible energy ecosystem supporting both consumers and businesses? What are your thoughts on that?
So look, this is the million-dollar question, really, and we don't have all the answers in place, that's for sure. We know some of the key elements that we need. We need to somehow make sure that we have a market that connects both what is happening really from the generation into the consumers. We need to have that underpinned by a kind of digital, we need the signals, we need the behaviour, and we need the incentives to make all of that connected. Now, it is incredibly complicated, and sort of sitting down in a room ourselves as a regulator isn't going to come up with the answer. We need to engage with many of the people here in the panel and much further beyond that to really kind of create that. And I think we also need to recognise that 2035, which is when the UK has committed to having a zero carbon energy system, electricity system, is not very far away. It might sound like it's far away, but in terms of the kind of the infrastructure that we need to get built, it's really quite soon. So on one hand, we need to go and talk to people, but we need to also act quickly. And I think what that means is that we need to kind of learn as we're going along. It's not like we're going to sit down and cook up the right solution. We need to just start going now. And I think, that's what's really exciting about being here on this panel, is that actually we are already on that journey. And just to say, I think also it's really important to recognise that the UK actually is pretty important in this journey. We wouldn't say, we are the leader in the world, but we are definitely up there. And I was just reflecting, we're talking about my optimism. I used to travel from Manchester to London on a daily basis, and earlier this year, I was really taken by Rugeley Power Station coming down. I used to travel past it on a weekly basis and thinking, my gosh, how are we ever going to get beyond this? Well, we've gone beyond it. That's not the conversation anymore. And that is, I think, really the key thing, is that we are already on this journey.
We're sat alongside an image of a beautiful UK, hopefully your offshore wind farm. Richard, you're a key vector in this mission. Jane's addressed the need for speed here. I'm sure you have some incredible challenges that you're adopting on a daily basis. Can you give us a sense of what you're doing to fix this energy ecosystem problem?
Sure. I think the first thing is renewables are really, truly, obviously a great thing. We have a great opportunity with wind, with solar, and some of the other options. They are now globally cost competitive. And I think obviously, so the first thing is we need a whole lot more of them, and we need it really quickly. So that means in terms of an ecosystem, we need to make sure that, of course, we're building the right infrastructure in the right places in a way that works for all stakeholders, but that we have the land, the grid connections, and the planning regimes that allow us to do that. I think the second thing for me is in order to do that, to bring on a whole lot more renewable clean power, we now obviously are already on a journey, but we have to do a lot in bringing forward energy storage of varying forms, batteries, water, hydrogen, and new technologies, because those storage mediums allow us to bring on more renewables. They allow us to generate clean power in the peaks and turn that gas down. I think the third thing is complementing more renewables and storage with a smart, flexible system in order to knit it all together to make demand and supply work really efficiently. And so what we're doing with, in my area with solar and with battery fits with that. A critical piece to our success is making sure that those batteries and those solar farms, maybe co-located, which we're starting to look at, work in a really smart fashion, integrated with the grid, with digital technology. They're dispatching at the right time to really make that market work efficiently.
What do you see as maybe some of the blockers? What's the friction in the system for delivering, say, the storage solutions that you just outlined as a key variable that we need to...
Yeah, so I mean, We talked about incentives. That's really important. I think a lot of good work's been done. I think it's really important that in the next few years, some of the uncertainty around the incentive system and how it's changing is moved forward quickly, so we have that ability to sort of invest and know where we're going with that. I think grid is a biggie. You know, we can't connect more renewables, of course, without those grid connections, and I think that's an area where a lot of pace is needed in order to really unblock that capacity that we can bring forward.
Richard at Eaton, I think that grid connection piece is something you'd like to maybe contribute to in the discussion.
Yeah, I think as we see, you know, first of all, just to backtrack, and I agree with some of the points that Jane and Richard have also made, but I think when we look at a sustainable energy system, that flexibility piece is really the key enabler of the deeper penetration of variable renewable generation. I think when we look back historically, where we had a small number of large central generators that could ramp up and down, because when we think that, you know, in order to maintain a stable system, we have to generate and feed onto the grid exactly the same amount as the load that's being drawn off the grid at any instant in time. And in past times, we just flex the generation, so they would run at part load and they could go up or down to meet that need as the load on the system changed. We now see that it's becoming less difficult because we haven't got those same readily dispatchable systems with the variable renewables. So we need to be able to flex both the generation and the demand. And the great thing is now that when we look at some of the technologies that we're starting to integrate onto the system, we can start to do that. So battery energy storage, EV charging, heat pumps, all inherently have a certain amount of flexibility built into them. So we can change the time and the power and how and when they use energy. So that really helps us access that flexibility. And then if we think about where those systems are going, they're going in consumers' premises. So businesses, industry, people's homes, right at the end of the line. So any flexibility that we can put at that location then actually is contributing to the balancing of the system on the wider distribution and transmission network, but also right down to the individual distribution feeder, right down to the local distribution transformer. So by having that flexibility, we can start to unlock more grid capacity. We can start to reduce some of the investment that might be needed to otherwise reinforce that grid network. And if we, yeah, I mean, if we look at some modelling that was done by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, that they concluded that unless we unlock deep sort of flexibility resources within the UK grid system by 2040 to achieve the sort of deep penetration of electrification that we need to decarbonise heat and transport, we could risk increasing the UK energy bill by £2.5 billion per year.
Yep.
So that flexibility really actually helps reduce the cost on the system, helps balance the system, helps enable us to get the most out of what we already have without having to overbuild extra.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point. We're talking about production and distribution, but bringing consumers along on the journey with pricing that works for them is obviously key. Nick, on your side with electric vehicles, we talked about battery storage. There's a very real technical possibility that electric vehicles can be a part of that battery storage solution with vehicle to grid, the grid feeding into battery storage in electric cars and vice versa. What's your take on that in your work?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think they can be absolutely part of the solution. I mean, what we're talking about is we need to make a massive push towards renewables. Those renewables create inflexibility within the system because they're inherently intermittent. And then how do you balance against that? And electric vehicles could be part of the solution. So we can already time and manage electric vehicle charging to align with that renewable energy. So if you have solar panels, we can ensure that we forecast the availability of demand on your house and then ensure that you're charging using that self-generated solar energy. That brings us that step further forward in terms of that smart and flexible energy system.
And it's something you're actively working on, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. We're doing this today. What we've talked about is like having really strong goals and ambition to get to. I think that's really key. We need to have a clear goal and ambition to get to a zero carbon energy system, because I think that sets everything else up. So it's great that I think the US announced yesterday that they're going to get rid of coal by 2030. That's great. We just need those things to come forward and forward and forward. I think that then sets up and then underneath that, we need the frameworks and the regulations and the incentives that then allow these things to come forward. And so there's a clear incentive today for a electric vehicle owner to charge using their self-generated solar energy, because it avoids them having to pay their energy bill. And that's awesome, because they can then get free energy into their electric vehicle. That's a clear incentive. We need more of those. I actually think the UK is sort of leading the world at this. We have signals within the distribution network now. We participate in markets with UKPN, Electricity Northwest, all of the distribution networks, where they're saying, I need capacity at this point in the network. And we have some electric vehicle chargers, and we provide capacity to that point in the network. That's pretty awesome. But we need just more of that. So that we can bring forward these solutions at scale and quickly.
Absolutely. Juliet, you're a pioneer in the sector. You've been on this journey for a long time. What's your take on this question?
But I think flexibility is obviously key. It's key in two ways. One, it delivers the certainty and the security around the system. As a piece of work we did at Good with Energy Systems Catapult on looking at, if you put a significant amount of renewables into the system, what happens? What does it mean from a flexibility point of view? And what does it mean from a cost point of view? And covering off those 2 points, yeah, you need flexibility of all types. And I think one of the areas we haven't invested enough is new ideas around flexibility. So we should be implementing the flexibility technologies we have today, but also look at the innovation side of that and bringing on the technologies for the 10 years after 2030. That is key. I think one of the things we haven't touched on this morning is we do need to push energy efficiency. We have some of the worst housing stock in the UK. Flexibility and renewables work much better if you have an overall lower demand. And although the eco has been in place for years and Ofgem have managed that, I think there are ways that we can accelerate that in terms of delivery alongside delivering other technologies into people's homes. One of the things we found really early on at Good is when people install a solar panel in their roof, they get much more worried, they care much more about their energy efficiency. They quite often then make an energy efficiency investment afterwards, and they care about when they use that power. So they start to have a behavioural change that matches the technology. And I think making sure that we consider the behavioural change alongside when we start engaging with consumers, the technology is really important and could actually reduce costs even further.
Yeah, I just want, if I can, just pick up on this conversation around consumers, because I think it's really critical. I mean, the CCC have said, you know, one way of looking at this really is, in effect, the first phase of our transition was stuff that happened somewhere far away. It was at the end of the wires. And what we're moving to next is the transition needs to go into people's houses. And I have to say, one of the things that came out this week, there was some reports about how people, what actions did they need to do to address climate change. And top of the list was recycling. And further down, quite significantly further down, was things around energy efficiency, how we drive our cars and how we heat our homes. And I felt that was slightly as a challenge for all of us, because all of us working in the energy field, it seems pretty obvious that the things that we should be doing, or consumers should be doing, is engaging firstly with the energy efficiency agenda, then with this flexibility agenda, but actually many people don't understand it. At Ofgem, we've just published a report that was a survey of over 4,000 people. 80% of people are really concerned about climate change, but 50% of people think that they're doing enough. Yet, on the other hand, if you put that alongside this other survey, it suggests that they probably don't realise what they should be doing. So we really need to collectively sort of make sure that that is understood by consumers if we want to make this change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that education piece is crucial. What Juliet was saying is, essentially, when people have renewable power, they feel empowered by that to take ownership of their energy decision making. Perhaps we could look at some ideas around the powerhouse, giving people the idea that their home is a power production facility rather than at a grand scale. So let's continue that theme on flexibility and look at the imported and exported energy. You know, the UK can't produce enough renewable energy on its own at the moment. Richard, you were talking about some of the connection piece issues, bringing energy in from other countries. What are your thoughts on that?
I was thinking about this question just yesterday, and sort of when I was preparing for this panel, and I looked. I've got a number of apps that tell me what's happening on the various carbon intensities of the various electricity systems around the world, and there's a very good app just called Electricity Map, and that shows you a global atlas, and the countries are coloured in different, green for good low carbon, and gets progressively darker down to sort of fairly black in some global locations. And I looked at the UK and I zoomed in and I thought, well, okay, I can see that our grid energy was at that time at about 300 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So that's the measure of the carbon intensity of the generation mix feeding onto our grid network at the time. And I was particularly interested to see what the new North Sea interconnector was doing. Because when we look at, we can talk about the UK, and we are an islanded system, but we have a significant number of connections and a significant power interconnection capacity to other European electricity markets. So at the time I looked, the North Sea link, we were importing around 700 megawatts of energy from Norway. And that energy in Norway is mostly clean hydro, and it had a carbon rating of 25 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So significantly lower than ours. So that's contributing to our carbon mix. But then as I go further around the east coast, I come to the BritNed interconnector, and we're importing 400 megawatts from the Netherlands, and the Netherlands are over 400 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So we start to see some big differences. And then come around to France and the IFA, we're exporting 1.7 gigawatts from the UK to France, and ours is much higher than the French grid system, which is, as you know, predominantly based on their large nuclear fleet. So it does illustrate quite starkly that whilst we can do what we do within the UK and we can, if you like, blaze a trail, we can be leaders, and I agree with Jane that we are up there with the best in the world. But we can't do it in isolation. It has to be Europe-wide, global-wide. Everybody needs to do it. So we've got to make sure that as we become more and more interconnected.
And if we're talking about educating consumers, I mean, you outlined what to an average consumer probably be a pretty complex series of energy calculations. How would you explain that in simple terms to consumers?
I suppose it's the flow of energy, and I think I agree that the consumer is at the heart of this, and with some of the things that Juliet and Jane have said, that we absolutely need to put them central in this discussion. And there isn't a high degree of understanding, and I think we recognise that there probably isn't a high degree of engagement. So really we perhaps need to make sure that those things are simple, and this is where the digitalisation piece comes in. Everybody's got an app, everybody understands an app, they can look at that, they can engage with that, and something's happening in the cloud. They've just got their EV plugged in, they've got their heat pump running. As long as they get their target temperature, as long as they have their charge in the morning, it doesn't really matter to them what happens behind the scenes. So it's up to industry and people like the services that Nick's offering to flex how we use that can help contribute that. So I think it's really just about understanding, or about enabling it to be easy so they don't necessarily have to understand those energy flows and those different carbon
perhaps it could be quite exciting to see that on an app that 1% of your energy comes from Norwegian hydroelectric power. Might be
effectively gamify it.
Exactly that. Yeah. So Richard, on that international piece, what's your take on that?
I think firstly, I actually think in the UK we have an abundance of wind. As we said, we are really leading the world in that area, and I think there was a study by National Grid, that showed that by 2035, it's highly likely the UK is actually a net exporter of clean, sustainable power. I think we're likely still to be importing at certain times, and I actually think that's a good thing. I think generally speaking, renewables empowers us all to generate clean power and energy locally. I think some diversification in the system is, of course, a good thing. So when it's particularly windy in one geography, sometimes it isn't in another, or sunny in one geography in another. That gives us all a bit of risk mitigation and optionality, if you like. So I think that's my take on it. I think renewables and the technologies we're talking about will empower a lot of us to go quite local. We're doing a lot with businesses and industrials in terms of what we talked about, bringing control and options to their site. But I think at the same time, having writ large a big grid system that's interconnected is also a good thing.
I did think for a second you were going to say in the UK we have an abundance of hot air, but then concerns on that one. Nick, your take on this question, please.
I mean, I'd just like to go back to the point around making it simple for consumers, because I think that's actually really, really key. If we want to get consumers involved in this, We just need to solve the problems that consumers face. So in electric vehicles, it's about charging is the fundamental challenge with owning an electric vehicle. We need to make that super simple. Juliet does that with ZapMap, for example. We tried to do it in the home charging space. And I think what you can do by doing that is create really exciting and innovative propositions. So like we're working with Volkswagen in Germany. And every Volkswagen vehicle gets shipped with some software that controls and optimizes against the grid carbon intensity. So Germany historically has run on a lot of coal, still runs on a lot of coal, but there is times in the grid when it's lower carbon than others. And so you get your Volkswagen vehicle, you plug it in, you get charged for the next morning, you can do your trip, but we're charging using the lowest carbon energy that's available. And from a consumer perspective, they just get credits back on their bill, and that's it. But they know they're doing the right thing. It's very simple, straightforward. We're still delivering the service that they wanted, which is they want to be able to drive the next day. But we can do all of the smart stuff in the energy system to optimize for low carbon energy and low carbon generation and ensure that that's flowing in the smartest possible way without having to worry or get the consumer to understand that on a day-to-day basis. They just know they're doing the right thing day in, day out and charging using the lowest carbon energy.
So returning to this continual theme of consumer engagement, do you find, do you track that engagement? Do you find the audiences are receiving this information in a very positive way?
Yeah, I mean, what we find is when you get your electric vehicle, you're super excited, you get your home charger, you connect it up, you start charging it, you don't really know how everything works, you're very excited about what the grid's doing, whether it's charging with your solar energy, and then sort of 2 weeks in, you go, oh, well, I just want it to charge. And so long as it just works, then that's fine. But what you hopefully have is you have somebody who's actually participating 100% in the energy system. Awesome. So they are a prosumer and they are doing things in the energy system, but you're not asking for their time because their time is really, really precious. And that's the real value. If you can make those two things work, do it, get 100% participation with no time, effort required from the end consumer, then we're in a really good place and we've hopefully unlocked flexibility then.
So lastly then, Juliet, turning to you on this international importing and exporting of energy, what's your take on this subject, please?
Well, I think we need everything from a flexibility point of view. And my view has always been interconnection has been a key part of this. We should do as much as we can within the UK, but we're part of a wider energy system. There's no reason why interconnection, I think the panel's covered it, can't support this. And I mean, we're definitely beginning to see wider thoughts about interconnection, where it could go, how it can support. One of the things I think we do need to think very carefully about, and this is going to be interesting from a regulation point of view, is how we minimize the number of interconnections that we're going to need to deal with significant amounts of offshore wind. So we've got to actually coordinate it. My understanding, I was talking to National Grid recently, and they were suggesting that if it's not coordinated, the number of connection points we're going to need into the UK just for offshore wind is going to increase by 2/3. So I think there is a coordination piece we need to think through quite deeply, and also consider where we want interconnectors. So it was touched on earlier whether we have a windy grid or a solar grid. I was actually reflecting on, this is the kind of language I used to use about 10 years ago, was slightly laughed at, I have to say, by some of the more senior members of the energy industry. It's so exciting to see that this is now part of the language that we use on an everyday basis, because it means we're going to solve some of these problems. But we should be thinking around, what do other countries have in terms of their grid, and make sure we don't just interconnect with another grid that looks like our own, because what you really need is diversity. And whether that's diversity of your customer base and influencing consumers, what the behavior they're going to have. Remember, we've got a time shift in terms of when the clocks move and what people do in their daily lives across Europe. So it gets darker at different times of day. One of the things maybe we should suggest, and we've talked about a long time, is whether we should think about when the clocks go back in this country and how that interconnects with the rest of Europe. So there's some quite interesting work that we could look at in terms of how do we maximize the interconnectivity? How do we use the different technologies across Europe, whether that's nuclear in France or whether that's sun in southern Spain, and really maximize the value on this system?
Very good. So we've touched on battery storage, obviously a key component in this renewable energy transition? How do we bring on battery storage rapidly? How do we do it sustainably? And what creative new technologies are there in the battery storage sector? Perhaps our definition, perhaps for consumers, of what a battery is needs to be completely rethought. Richard, it's a key area of your work. What's your position on this?
Sure. Well, in some ways, batteries are one of those things that could be a climate hero. I think was what the BBC, well, it was quite a good video on it last few days from the BBC. It's just clearly essential to, as we said earlier, to bringing more wind and more solar onto the grid, that we have these technologies here now to keep that grid going and to keep it stable and to produce power at peak times. I think your question's really, what can we do to supercharge this? I feel like, if you excuse the pun, and in a sustainable way. I think the first thing is create the structures for industry to innovate, and to innovate at pace, obviously, so we can build out projects, develop projects in the right way and in the right places to support the grid where it needs it. And I think that clearly needs to happen in lots of different locations. This is becoming more location specific. So one of the things that's started to happen, but I think needs to happen more, is that we've started to create a market here in the UK for the services these batteries can provide. So the distribution networks and National Grid have started to create tenders saying, I'm going to need something like a battery in this part of the country. And I think we need more of that and more incentives around that. I think technology can keep moving forward. It does take time, but the more I think that governments and industry are investing in the next technology, I think being realistic that these things do take time to come to market and bring them to market, but there's some really interesting iron, sodium-based battery technologies coming down the line, and I think we're going to need these as the volumes increase.
What's exciting about some of these new technologies to you?
So I think touching on Juliet's point around diversification, and I think when you think through how much power now needs to grow, if we electrify heat and transport, the volume, the supply, the power market in the UK, we need to be generating a lot more power, and we're going to need a lot more storage mediums, as hydro and hydrogen as well. That can create supply chain challenges. So having diverse chemistries of different types helps to manage some of that risk around supply chain. Different metals from different parts of the world. I think that diversification is really important.
Could I pick up on a couple of those points? Well, a couple actually, but particularly the bit about the markets. And we do see markets starting to emerge. But at the moment, I think they're quite difficult to participate in, particularly if you've got a large battery asset, 10, 20, 50, 100 megawatts connected to the grid, then it's easier to participate in those sorts of ancillary services markets. I think as a building occupier with a relatively small battery in a solar system, we really need to develop sort of open, transparent and accessible markets so those people can actually get rewarded for the value of the flexibility that they provide to the system. And I think until we can do that, it's quite difficult to make the business case today without that market structure in place.
Certainly for on-site batteries with the customer.
So then when we have that business case, then we'll get the private investment coming in, and then we'll see the market accelerate and speed up. So it's really about trying to get that business case.
Jane, coming on to you, but can we add in an element of why battery storage is needed for our wider audience? We're talking about educating wider audiences. Why with renewables do we need battery storage, whereas we didn't with previous forms of energy? Jane, would you like to?
So what I was going to say was in this in a new system, the old system was unidirectional. We had the power station at the end of it that went up and down as we changed demand. Going back to the point that in a system that's basically has renewables at its base together with nuclear, that's generating when the resources are available, when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing. And what we need to be able to do is to match that together with productive use. So whether that is people flexing their demand, charging their electric vehicle, using their heat pumps at the right time, but we also need to take some of that energy and store it in some way. And I was going to slightly expand the definition of what we need to do into energy storage, not just batteries. But so batteries are one form of energy storage that we're going to need to then, when we have less availability of those renewables, we can then use that. And arguably you can think of interconnectors as a kind of form of storage. We're using, I mean, it's one way of thinking of it. It's not really energy storage, but it's one way of matching your supply and demand in this new future world. So what I was going to say is that what's different about this future world really is that the flows of energy are not just going in one direction. They're going in many different directions, up and down the wires. But we also need to think of the whole system at very different scales. We need to think about it at the scale of people's houses, and we need to think about it in this kind of European mega scale. You know, we've had interconnectors for a long time, but the quantity and the requirements for those will increase as we try to tap into other forms of renewable supply elsewhere. But I think energy storage is absolutely critical, but energy storage itself will also need to happen at a variety of scales, for a variety of times, for a variety of different purposes. In the UK, we're going to need something that is going to be able to give us the energy that we need in the winter to heat our homes. So that might require some form of energy storage to give us that energy, but that's probably not a battery, because it's really a long duration seasonal storage. But equally, I'm very excited about the possibility of electric vehicles. By 2030, we're going to have 150 gigawatt hours of batteries on the system just from electric vehicles. Now, they're not the solution to everything at all, but that's a huge amount. I mean, that's already kind of 16 times one of our existing pumped storage facilities, which is another form of energy storage. So kind of tapping into that and using what we already know is going to be there, is going to be part of the solution. But it is not, I think the key thing is, it's very boring, but there is not one size fits all. Actually, the future is that there is so many different scales, and that gives actually quite a lot of excitement.
I have an electric vehicle, and I actually enjoy the vehicle, I think, more seeing it sat on the drive, thinking, okay, this is part of a battery storage solution for a wider renewable energy grid than I perhaps do actually driving it. And so, Nick, I mean, there's a lot of criticism around electric vehicles and sustainability with batteries. What's your take on that in this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, we have to figure out, there are issues with electric vehicles. Like, we have to figure out how we build them sustainably and then recycle them at the end. We can't just think about them as, oh, we just transition to electric vehicles and then forget about how we recycle the materials that go into it. But I agree with a lot of what's been said. I mean, just to bring this down into like, how are individual houses going to change in terms of their demand, and why does flexibility matter? I mean, if a typical house today uses about 3,000 kilowatt hours, when you buy an electric vehicle, you might sort of almost double that consumption. So it's like you've got a house, and you've added another house to that house. And so the networks and the whole system has to be able to cope with that. Great thing is the electric vehicle the load on that thing is now entirely flexible. And so you can put that second house into the time when you weren't using energy on your first house. And so hopefully those two things can fit, and we can fit them within our existing networks. But then we've got to decarbonize heat as well. And so we're going to increase demand further. It's going to probably go up another 2, 3, 4 times. And so we'll probably need more networks, actually, I think, at some point. But we also need to do that in a flexible way. And all of these tools and assets, the electric vehicles, the heat pumps, are potential sources of flexibility as well. And what makes me very optimistic is that, unlike historical demand that's completely inflexible, these can be moved around to meet renewable generation that's on the grid, and hopefully then can help us decarbonize even faster.
So you've got 2 houses, but not at the same time. So perhaps there's an education piece for that slightly abstracted idea for consumers. Juliet, what's your take on this batteries question?
I mean, just going back to why do we need it in the first place? So one of the reasons why we always traded 100% renewable was to really understand the challenges of being 100% renewable. And over time, what we've seen is, so we have a mixed portfolio of wind, solar, biomass, and small hydro. What we found was we could balance nearly 87% of the time in real time on that kind of portfolio. So you kind of then looking at, well, how do I balance that other piece? And I agree with the panel that we need a whole different types of different storage, whether that's size, whether that's location, and whether that's technology as well. I mean, one of the organizations I'm working a little bit with is something called Gravitricity, which is looking at dropping weights essentially down mine shafts or old mine shafts. Again, another form that gives you a differential in the system, and it is about the diversity piece. One of the reasons why you do need storage and flexibility, and it's one of the key things we tested with Energy Systems Catapult, was this sort of 2 or 3 week energy sort of weather system. So we get weather patterns now that sit over sort of Northern Europe. And that again, when we're looking at interconnectivity, we need to think about the overall weather patterns and how they're being affected by the changing climate. Because also one of the things we're also being affected by is changing weather systems. And just coming to interseasonal, I think sometimes we use that quite loosely in terms of what it means. The actual main period that we need to think about being able to store things for is about a 2-3 week period. If you look at the detailed modeling, the winter summer period, actually wind and solar balance that fairly effectively, because wind produces a lot more in the winter and solar produces a lot more in the summer. And if you get a balance between how much you bring on between those two technologies, you can actually fix that sort of heating and winter heating capability quite significantly. What we really need is that kind of 2 or 3 week storage piece and being able to balance power over when particularly Northern Europe gets hit by a low.
The Germans have an interesting word for that, Juliet. I don't know if you've come across it, but they have a word, it's Dunkelflaute, and it literally translates as a dark wind lull.
Yes.
And effectively it describes those weather systems that you've just mentioned sitting over Europe. So when we need that interconnection and we need that flexibility and the 2 or 3 week storage capacities that you've referenced there. So one for the dictionary, Dunkelflaute.
Yeah, do you think we could come up with our own UK version?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it is yet, but I'm sure we could go out to social media and come up with something fantastic.
Compound German nouns, a continuing theme of the Decarbonisation Summit, although perhaps one for the English education or British education piece. We talked a lot about energy on this abstracted grand scale level. Let's talk now about the consumer. We've also referenced throughout this conversation the need to educate consumers. So, let's think about the democratization of energy. Solar power at the home, battery storage in the home, an electric vehicle. These are high price items that a lot of consumers simply can't afford. So how do we bring consumers along on this journey? Maybe one starting off from an OFGEM perspective, Jane.
Yeah, so I think, the first thing to say about the transition to electric vehicles is, of course, not everyone will be able to afford an electric vehicle, but not everyone already can afford a car. So, but the important thing about electric vehicles, and I think this is quite different to heat, is that actually electric vehicles, because of the fact they are batteries on wheels, they can actually play an enabling feature to keeping the cost of the energy system down for everybody. And I think that is pretty important. So even if you can't afford an electric vehicle, still the existence of that transition to electric vehicles is keeping the cost of the system down, or will make that system cheaper, the electricity cheaper for everybody. And I think that is a pretty important thing to get across. But in terms of making sure that everybody is part of this journey, inclusivity is a key theme of COP, and we need to make sure that people are protected on this journey. And as the innovation comes forward, we're thinking about, we've just been talking about kind of a grand vision in which people are using their apps on their smartphones and controlling their heat. Not everyone is going to be able, willing to participate in that way, and we need to think, as those new markets come forward, for example, energy services, how do we think about regulating those? How do we make sure that people are protected? And I think those offerings need to start to come forward, and then we can look at what the kind of key issues are behind them. But absolutely, I mean, OFGEM is there to protect consumers on that journey, and we need to make sure that everybody is with us and everyone is protected, because if we don't, we are not going to reach our end goal.
Richard from SSE, how do we bring everyone along on this journey?
Yeah, I think a just transition is something we've talked a lot about, certainly within SSE, but also outside more recently. It's critical. I think one thing that's really important is that this journey, this transition, allows us as a nation to control our energy a bit more. I think, going into the future, and I think whilst we have to protect people because there'll be challenges with getting there, investing in the kinds of infrastructure we've talked about brings a lot of that energy home. It's closer to home, and it's based on capital investment rather than where the geopolitics is going over in other parts of the world. I think the second thing for me is there's a piece here actually about our economy and jobs. I think there's huge opportunity with this transition for Britain to continue to nurture new industries that bring a lot of jobs. We're seeing that with the offshore wind industry and the wind industry. We're seeing it, I think, now with industries like solar and electric vehicles. Those are two big things for me. I think it, in what we do in the part of SSE I work in, we also work with the B2B market, with businesses and those kinds of consumers. And we're finding that increasingly they are sitting up and saying, hey, this is really important to us. We want to invest. We want to talk to you about you investing with us in taking control of our energy, a bit more resilience and our carbon footprint. So, yeah.
Thank you. Juliet, in your work, you've been intimately bound up with the consumer question side of things. What's your sense of how we go on an inclusive journey to bring people in on this renewable energy transition?
So I think it's really interesting because I think ownership models are changing, and we've been stuck for quite a long time in that we need to own all this technology. It's a kind of mentality. Our home is, we own everything in our home, and that route. And the reality is that most people don't own their cars anymore. Most people go out for a lease on their cars, and what we're seeing is emerging models, particularly in the transportation sector, where ownership and leasing are sort of becoming sort of interchangeable. And you go out and you essentially buy a car that has all the charging requirement with it. It has the insurance with it. And what's interesting about that is because charging a car is about a quarter of the cost of powering it with fossil fuel, actually the life cycle looks much lower. So your monthly cost potentially is either the same or lower than going to a fossil fuel already. And I think this is one of the communication pieces that we really need to get better at, is talking about how some of these models, these funded models, could actually reduce the cost for the consumer. I mean, if you look at, for example, installing a solar panel in your roof today, now most consumers can't think about what that cost might be over a period of time, and most people get worried about that. But essentially, you're about half the cost of buying power on the system, and looking at today's energy prices, putting a solar panel on your roof is probably much better than ever switching your electricity supplier. So I think there's some language around this. We also then need to look at the funding models. And again, that's where the regulation comes in. How do we safely look after consumers while potentially offering them funding to do this, where they don't have to own this technology, but they can benefit from the reduced cost of it?
Yeah, I think the language piece is really important. We've talked about German compound nouns, which isn't perhaps the way forward, but you've used the word costs a lot there, Juliet. In the electric vehicle space, people talk about total cost of ownership. Maybe we should be reframing that in terms of total savings of ownership and talk about the savings that all of these technologies can deliver. Nick, what's your sense of this?
Yeah, I mean, Juliet's absolutely right that the running costs of an electric vehicle are just so much less than running an internal combustion engine vehicle, that is a massive advantage. And if you bundle it up as a monthly lease, then you start to see actually this is, versus buying a new petrol car, this is actually becoming quite cost competitive. And obviously a second-hand market will come through and these things will start to push down on the costs. I mean, obviously over the last few months we've had the energy crisis, we've seen the rising price of gas. We're in an interconnected world, we are exposed to those rising power prices. It's very negative for most people, like our power bills have all gone up dramatically, or they will go up dramatically over the next 6 to 12 months. But what makes me optimistic is similar to Juliet's argument around like installing solar panels. That differential now is just huge because the cost of gas is so high versus the cost of your self-generated solar energy. There's a massive incentive there for people to come forward and install their own renewable energy. There's a massive incentive for us to install more renewable energy on the system. And I think we should probably be telling more of a story about how in the future, costs of energy can actually fall if we take control of the energy system and we have our own self-generated wind and we have a flexible energy system and we can be in control of the cost, and those costs can actually be lower because at the moment, generating energy from wind is zero marginal cost, as is generating energy from solar. So that's actually quite an awesome future that we could be facing off towards.
Ending on a high note, Richard, how do we bring consumers along on this journey to include everyone?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we haven't really touched on in this panel so far, when we talk about that, and clearly it's a very important area, is really a bit of a change of mindset, that because we all been talking about either owning or having somebody finance this technology in our home, and we all expect we've got a car that's parked outside our house. Do we all really need a car? At the moment, there's too many cars on the road, there's too much congestion, so if we just swap the ICE cars, the combustion engine cars, to electric cars, we'll still have the same congestion. So maybe we need to change our mindset about how we travel and put the facilities in to encourage walking and cycling, to encourage shared ownership of vehicles, to encourage more public transport, and actually reduce the number of vehicles and make travel accessible to everybody for a low-cost, convenient, easy solution. And I think that's another important piece of the jigsaw.
Very good. So we're coming to the end of this super insightful discussion around energy. I wanted to ask you all at the end, from the conversations you've heard amongst your fellow panelists, what ideas do you think you might want to pick up, share, that have excited you that you've heard today? Nick, maybe you first. What have you heard from your fellow panelists that you think is something you might like to run with at EV Charge?
We've talked a lot about how regulation, to a certain extent, has to support all of this, the movement towards a zero carbon energy system. I think definitely what we could do more of is we're working in lots of different international markets, and I see that if we standardise the approach to the way that we're trying to integrate these things, I think the UK is kind of leading the way, and I think we could make more about that and talk more about that in California when we're working there, talk more about that in Germany, and talk more about that in Europe and elsewhere where we're rolling out electric vehicle charging infrastructure.
Thank you. Richard from SSC, what, in the spirit of collaboration, which ideas are the ones that you think are worth sharing from this conversation?
So we talked a bit about the importance of working at different levels in this new world, at a very micro or local level, but also the international level. And that really resonated for me. I think what we're doing in our business at the moment is just that. We're working on, big solar farms and batteries, but also smaller solar farms close to customers, physically next to them. And I think a couple of my fellow panelists talked about the power and the importance of showing through simple but smart data where your power is coming from and how much carbon is associated with it at any one point in time. I think that's a really important component here. The smart platforms, the sort of thing Nick and his colleagues are developing, that provide those services to show that. Of course, we're looking to do the same with what we do, but I think it's increasingly an interconnected world. And there's another interesting challenge: how are we all going to make all our digital data and our platforms fit together and work together? So,
Richard from Eaton, your take on this?
Yeah, I think probably a fairly strong theme running through the discussions this morning has been about energy system flexibility and about all the different technologies that can contribute to that. And I tend to think like that of changing energy use in space and time. So where we use it and when we use it, which is critical to enabling that, and then having the regulation to allow those markets to flourish, to enable consumers to get the remuneration for the services that they provide to stabilise the grid system. So I think all of the technologies that we've discussed, all of the regulations, all sort of key into that central theme.
Jane?
So I'm not going to actually pick a single thing. I think I've really, there's been a number of conversations here around flexibility, and in particular I'm conscious that people here have lots of expertise and they have contacts elsewhere, and I think kind of building on this conversation, reflecting, we need the regulation for flexibility, kind of continuing those conversations about what do we actually need to put in place in a kind of fairly technical, not in a public forum, not to the public, what actually do we need behind the scenes to make that all work is what I think really needs to happen. But the thing I'm going to take away from this panel actually is the kind of enthusiasm and the can-do and the excitement that it's going to happen. So.
Juliet, a last burst of collaborative enthusiasm from you, please.
Well, I first of all completely agree with all the panel. I think all of those are elements of what we need to do. I think for me, what came out very strongly is to change the conversation with the consumer. I think for too long to be honest, all we've explained to consumers is that they can switch supplier. I think there's so much more they can do in terms of their role in this marketplace, while protecting them, but also engaging them positively in a simple way that they can become, whether it's the way they drive, whether they transport themselves, heat their homes, or power their homes. They are part of the system, and bringing a collaborative conversation with them to make a simple way of explaining how important they are in the system and how we can make sure that they access it.
Thank you, Juliet, and thank you to all of our panel for powering such a fantastic conversation around renewable energy, a hugely important and hot, to not excuse the pun, topic. Thank you very much indeed.